In the sprawling hive cities of the far future, life is cheap and space is scarce. Citizens of the Underhive build their modest homes with whatever scrap materials are available, assembling makeshift shanty towns which cling like barnacles to the massive pipes and conduits that bring resources to the upper levels. In these vile slums, criminal gangs fight for supremacy, and to wander down the wrong cramped alleyway is to invite certain death, or worse. Welcome to Eric's Hobby Workshop. Today we're headed into the Underhive to build something that I've wanted to build for quite a while now, which is a shanty town. There's going to be a lot of techniques that I go over in this video, some new, some old if you've been watching the channel for a little while, but let's get right into it because it's going to be a fun one. Alright, so before we get started, let's take a look at some reference images. There are shanty towns all over the world. They exist in many countries in the developing world, and they have some common elements between them, and let's take a look at that. So one of the things that we notice right away is they have a lot of corrugated metal, and they have a very uneven roof lines, and my favorite ones, like the favelas in Brazil, are sort of built on top of each other in a really cool, interesting way that gives a lot of shapes. Another thing I noticed is that some of them are very colorful, and I really like that. I like the idea that even though some of these houses are quite modest, people still take pride in them and try to make them cheerful and aesthetically pleasing. And that's really nice, and I want to keep that. Okay, so once I've looked at a couple images, I'm going to start sketching and sketch out something that's just going to be a rough guide for me to build from. Just some ideas of what might be a fun shape, what might look cool. And my final build's not going to look that much like my sketch, but it's something to kind of guide me a little bit for when I get stumped. So you can see what I'm working on here. I've got little shanty-like structures built around a central pipe, and there's a smaller pipe coming out that's going to be pouring water, and I really want to have a staircase in behind here that goes behind the falling water. I think that'd be really cool. And yeah, maybe a little culvert down at the bottom to have that water sort of go somewhere from this bottom reservoir. That seems pretty cool. Alright, with that done, let's jump into the build. Before we go any further, let's take a quick moment to look at today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. Raid Shadow Legends is a mobile RPG where you put together a crack team of champions and scour dungeons, defeating all kinds of enemies from dragons to evil undead sorcerers. I downloaded Raid a while ago, and I really like pulling it out in those in-between moments, like when you're waiting for a train or when you're in line somewhere, because it's really easy to jump in and out of the game. My favorite bit is upgrading my champions in the tavern. It's very satisfying. You get strangely attached to your champions. It's like, these are my crew, you know? Raid is the #1 mobile RPG in the US, with over 70 million downloads, over 1 million daily players, 2 billion live player battles, and 10 billion PvE battles fought. This month they're releasing a new batch of epic and legendary champions, which look amazing, and they're also releasing this second version of the Doom Tower. If you want to get a huge head start in Raid, all you have to do is hit the link in the description or scan my QR code and you'll get your free epic champion, Jotun, who's amazing for the Doom Tower. 100,000 silver, 50 gems, and 3 ancient swords so you can summon champions as soon as you get into the game. All this treasure will be waiting for you right here. So check out Raid Shadow Legends, guys. Thanks, Raid, and let's get back to the video. So, as I mentioned, this particular district of the Underhive is going to be built around a big pipe that's going from one layer to another. And so to accomplish that, I used this cardboard tube that I got from the post office. This is usually for mailing pictures and maps and other things that you need to roll up to mail. And I used some of this brown packing tape that you can also get at the post office, and wrap that around just to cover that spiral pattern that makes it look distinctively like a cardboard tube. So I just go around that thing, covering the whole thing. There's a seam on one side, but it's going to get covered anyways, so it doesn't really matter. But it won't have that spiral pattern, which is nice. So then with another length of the cardboard, I'm going to trace onto some XPS foam a little outing here for the culvert that's going to drain the pool that I'm going to make a little later on in the build. And I just pull that away and then With a bunch of rough chunks of XPS foam, I'm going to do a little brainstorming here and just kind of feel my way through this. So I'm just using XPS foam to block out the rough structure of the base of the building. This part is going to be concrete when it's finished, and XPS foam is a good way of getting that sort of featureless walls that concrete makes. So once I have my pieces roughly cut into place, I do a quick mock-up without any glue, and that's about the shape I'm going for. So when I'm satisfied with that, I'm going to cut another piece and make that culvert into something that leads into the structure a little bit more, so when you peer through into it, you can see it sort of curving off and away into the darkness. It's not going to have much detail back there because it's going to be very difficult to see back there, but these little details add a lot when the thing comes together. So next I'm using some Gorilla Glue construction adhesive to glue all the foam together. I've been talking a lot about this recently if you watched any of my previous videos, but this stuff is amazing. Clean up any excess with a little bit of alcohol, and this stuff bonds foam extremely well. It's very tacky right off the bat, so you can build quickly without having to clamp anything, because the lightweight nature of the foam and this tackiness of the Gorilla Glue really makes an easy workflow. So here I'm using that piece of culvert, and I'm doing what I described a moment ago, which is I'm cutting the pieces on an angle and sort of curving them off to the left. Now, this is not very precise, as you can see, and I'm just holding it together with some more of that brown tape, but it's going to be just fine. It's, again, one of those pieces that you're not going to really see, so sometimes you got to cut corners here and there if you want to save a little bit of time, you know what I'm saying? So that's all I'm doing there. It's just kind of cobbling that together, save a little bit of time, but end up with something that is a nice little detail still. There you go, you can see. It's not perfectly smooth on the inside, but who says it has to be? What are you, a culvert expert? I'm not, that's for sure. And besides, this is the Underhive. Things are a little bit more ramshackle. So next, I'm going to keep adding some other pieces of foam to build out more structure. Right now, I'm just kind of composing the basic shapes of the structure. I'm trying to get a nice building block of an interesting shape to build on, really, and this is kind of a process that's totally improvisational. I did do a sketch to plan it out, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of trial and error here. There's a lot of cutting pieces, holding them up to see how they look, cutting pieces of foam core, making some shapes. As you can see here, I'm cutting the foam core on a bevel and an angle to get a nice corner piece. And that allows me to make a nice boxy shape. And I make a lot of sort of just boxy shapes like this and hold them up on the structure and see where they're going to look good. And once I'm satisfied with them, I can trace out some chipboard to make a base, and that'll give them some rigidity and also a bottom. And I just build that way, really, improvisationally, cutting, trimming, use a bit of hot glue to glue the foam core structure on. And that's essentially my method for building these basic shapes. Now these foam core pieces are going to be the actual shanty houses themselves, and you'll see why in a moment when I start cutting into them. But generally speaking, I use the pink XPS foam for concrete and the foam core for the shanty houses themselves. Here I'm using a little piece of granny grating, which is a knitting mesh that you can get at an arts and crafts store. And I'm just test fitting for a little grate for the culvert. And the reason why is I want a little bit of detail, I want a nice rusty grate in there, and I want to further obscure your ability to look down into that tunnel there to kind of hide that there's not much to look at in there. But so I cut out basically some of the extra links, and that allowed me to get a coarser grid than that distinctive granny grating look. You know, granny grating is a great material, but once you've been crafting with it for a while, your eye can pick it up pretty easily. So this modification is something that I've done in the past that makes it less instantly recognizable, and I'm a little bit happier with that. So there's that grid. Pretty happy with how that's looking. Now with this basic shape done, I'm going to take my Gorilla Glue and I'm going to put it all around the perimeter, being careful to make a nice seal, and I'm going to glue that to a piece of chipboard. I put quite a lot of weight on there to try to flatten it down because the piece of chipboard was a little bit warped, which is annoying, but these things happen. And so I'm just going to pile some heavy stuff on there to hold it down. Like that's like, you know, a coffee grinder and a bag of glue sticks. You got to work with what you got. So next I'm going to cut off the excess chipboard from around the structure, and there you go, like a nice invisible base. And the piece is nicely fitting onto that piece of chipboard. There are a lot of custom pieces of chipboard that I cut and glued and onto existing shapes, and that's just kind of done on an improvisational basis as well. Just kind of measuring, eyeballing, trial, error. Here's a good example of why you need a dual temperature glue gun. The glue was way too hot when I put this down, and you can see it melted into the foam and didn't actually bond very well. So I'm switching my glue gun to low, and while that cools down a little bit, I'm going to take an opportunity to dump some acrylic black paint into the back of that structure while the top is still open, and paint it black in there, because it'll be really difficult to paint in there once this thing's put together, and this will just help you to have that Stygian blackness that if you look down into the culvert. Nice. Okay, so with a little low temperature hot glue, I'm able to glue that nice block on there, which is on a jaunty angle because I want to have this staircase reaching over from this lower level up to that level there. Now the stairs I'm using are O-scale styrene stairs by Plastruct. I'll put a link in the description. These are really great. They're a model railroad kit, and I find the scale is just perfect for the 28-32mm Warhammer Necromunda scale. So I really like these stairs. I got a whole bunch of them for this build, and they're a crucial component of it, so check out the link in the description if you want some. Here you can see I'm adding more little areas where the stairs can go on. I really wanted this piece to feel like there were stairs going all over it, like an MC Escher drawing or something. Normally I use a lot of ladders when I'm building, but since this is supposed to be a residential structure, like realistically, I mean, even though this is the dark future, these people still have to like carry bags of groceries and stuff, presumably. I mean, I don't know, maybe they have nutrient slurry paste piped directly into their homes, but I figured stairs is more appropriate for residential than ladders in any case. So even though there might be ruder slums that have just ladders, I'm happy to have just stairs on this build, and it adds really a cool appearance as well. So here you can see I'm adding a box that I fabricated as a completely enclosed box, and I'm putting that on the edge there with the staircase running along the side of it to the top of it, and then I'm going to close that in with another prefabricated box. And what that's going to do is create a really cool negative space under the stairs in between these two shanty structures, and that's like an area that there'd be like some rats or something. That's the fun part about improvising these, is you get these fun little moments picking out. So here's the tube from inside a roll of aluminum foil. And I'm cutting that with my hobby saw, and that's going to be a piece of piping we're going to use in a moment. I'll just add another little structure here to make sure the spacing's right, and then I'll add a short length of pipe coming out of the central pipe, and that's going to be a little waterfall down into the pool below a little later, and it's going to be awesome. You'll see. Add a little bit of cereal box around the outside to just give it more of a pipe-like cladding at the end of it. Here's a tiny little window box type thing that adds a nice landing for the stairs. And as you can see, this is kind of my process as I build. I hold things up, I squint at them, I beat my head against the wall, I hold them up in a different pattern, and it goes pretty slowly to be honest, but I think the juice is worth the squeeze because you end up with some really cool shapes when it's all said and done. Here you can see I've added another structure on the roof of those other two, and this one overhangs the pathway that you would take to climb up the stairs below, and I'm really happy with that because that's going to be a cool little dark alley when we're all done. Now here's a method for making walkways that I've shown in some previous videos. I add some sculptor's mesh and super glue it to this little toy here. These toys are called Ruminate, and they are a dollhouse building tool. I guess like build your own dollhouse using Ruminate, and I bought a bag of them at a thrift store a while back, and I'm almost out, so I'm gonna have to buy some more because I really like the way they work as these little platforms. But as you can see, they make nice little landings for when the platforms cantilever out over nothingness, and that contrast of the interior stairs going under the structures and these platforms stretching over spans, I think creates a really cool dynamic for this piece, and I'm really happy with how that turned out. So here's a little I-beam that I made out of pieces of chipboard, just 3 pieces of chipboard of equal length glued together in an eye pattern. And now I'm adding some plastic pipes. These are just another cheap child's building toy that I'll put a link for in the description. You can get a huge bag of these for like $8, and they're pretty awesome. And as you can see, these make some nice industrial looking pipes that sort of tie this in with the rest of the Underhive aesthetic that I've been going for. For longer pipe lengths, I use pieces of dowel of a similar gauge, and that's just because the straight pieces in the pipe sets are actually fairly scarce. Like, you get a lot of, T-joints and actually like X-joints that I've never used because I'm no plumber, but I don't think an X-joint is very common. But that's neither here nor there. As you can see, we are nearing the top of the structure. I made this piece exactly 12 inches tall, and I'm going to do a nice flat top. And the reason for that is because I want you to be able to stack other structures on top of this eventually. I'd love to have this continue up in a further build, or add, a existing piece on top of there, maybe a Games Workshop kit, some sort of industrial looking piece of machinery. The sky's the limit, really. But here I'm using a little bit of pre-made spackle and filling in some of the gaps on my concrete pieces. This is just a nice way to unify those pieces of foam so it looks less like it's glued together bits of foam and looks a little bit more like it's poured concrete. Now I'm making a bunch of doors. My preferred dimension for doors is 1 inch by 1.5 inch, which is not exactly the ratio that you would see in a normal door in the real world, but I'm pretty consistent with that across my builds, and it gives sort of a stylistically unifying piece. It's also a width that a guy with a 25mm base could actually walk through. You can see I've made some chipboard support struts in a similar way to the I-beam, and I use those to support my more precarious looking platforms as well. This is another piece from Plastruct, which is a support beam, and this adds a nice little bit of detail as well. This would be pretty hard to scratch build, very finicky thin pieces, and so I prefer to just use the Plastruct pieces. But you could easily make something like this, just a little I-beam out of chipboard if you didn't want a spring for the Plastruct. There's a length of pipe. I'll show you a little bit later how to make those pipes. But back to the doors. I decided to detail the doors with little bits of cereal board and little punched out pieces of plastic card. And a good way to add these rivets is to grab them with the tip of an X-Acto knife and dip them in super glue, and then apply them with the tip of your knife. The stickiness of the super glue will pull them off the tip of your knife if you do it right. And that's great. So once we have the doors built, I'm going to cut into the foam core, but not all the way. I'm going to leave that back piece of paper there and just cut into it and then scrape away with a flat edge thing. In this case I'm using a file, but you don't need to use a file. And then put a bit of super glue in there, and that's going to make my doors recessed, which gives a little bit more realistic detail. I actually did 6 or 7 different doors on the structure, and they're all different, and I think that adds a lot of character. You can see this one here is made out of actually another Plastruct product, which is a diamond sheet plastic card, and I'll try to link that in the description as well, although I was having trouble finding it a little while ago, so fingers crossed. Here you can see I'm starting to add some corrugated paper to add that corrugated metal look. Corrugated paper is an awesome and cheap way to add a ton of detail to a rough industrial project like this. And so are little pipes like this. I'm using a paper straw and I'm wrapping it in masking tape. And then once that's on, I'm going to glue a little piece of cereal board around the outside to act as a pipe fitting. And that'll just add some nice detail to these little pipes. And we can apply those on wherever we want to add a little bit of detail. I put some up here against the other pipe to add some more vertical detail and kind of sell the idea that there's plumbing and things running into these little shanty structures. I made some windows in a similar way to the doors, using the same sculptor's mesh that I used for my platforms, and then some cereal box to detail that. And that gives sort of a nice, what I would think is a little bit safer type of window, where you have metal mesh in it, almost like if you remember at school they used to have those windows that had the wires in them, so that if someone shattered it, it wouldn't really break. Yeah. Here I've made a little facade for one of my structures in here because it's so hard to reach in there. So I built it first and then glued it in there. Here's a little bottle that I've had kicking around that I figured would make a cool little tank for something somebody's got going on. Maybe that's fresh water, maybe they're distilling something, maybe that's a furnace of some kind. It's really up to your imagination. But I had another window next to it and a little grate that I had lying around in my bits box as well. And as you can see, I've made a tremendous mess, so let's tidy up a little bit before moving on. Nice. I'm going to add a little bit of Mod Podge and then a little bit of sand. And that sand is going to add sort of grimy build up to the corners that's really going to sell the disheveled nature of the structure. And I turn it upside down to get all that excess sand off, give it a few taps, and then I'm going to come in with some black paint mixed with Mod Podge and paint that over all my foam areas to seal them in, and also all the paper areas. All that corrugated paper is going to get a coat of this Mod Podge as well, because when I use some watery washes in the future steps, I don't want it to warp the paper or soften it too much, because that could be a problem. Next, let's jump ahead to painting. I lost a little bit of footage here, but I spray painted it black and then brown, and then I dry brushed it with a little bit of silver, which you can see me doing here. And that gives a nice base for the rusty metal that's going to be a large component of the structure. And there you go. You can see it's really coming together as an interesting looking structure at this point, and I'm thrilled with how it's looking. So next I'm going to make a rusty wash with some yellow paint, some red paint, and a little bit of brown paint, and a lot of water. And I'm just going to apply this pretty liberally all over everything. It looks like, you know, that water if you make your craft dinner too runny at this point, but it's going to dry a lot more subtle. Next I'll take a little bit of gray craft paint and I paint all the areas that I want to be concrete. And just this piece here really adds a nice bit of contrast between that dark rusty metal, and I'm really happy with how that's looking. Next I'm going to paint black and green mixed together to be the bottom of this little pool here. I want there to be an illusion of depth, and that's going to help with that. I put a black wash everywhere and streak it onto the concrete bits a little bit, which adds some realism. Next I'm going to use this DAP gel stuff. It's like a clear sealant, and Luke's APS recommended this stuff to me as a water effect, and it's pretty good. It smells pretty strong, but it's easier to work with than a silicone or something like that because it's easy to glue. One of my patrons recommended I cut a hole in the grate, so here I am doing that. By the way, if you want to become a Patreon, link in the description. Let's pour some resin, guys. I'm using 2-part easy cast resin, which I warm up first because that helps the little bubbles disappear, and then I mix it in 2 equal parts. You know what, I'm not going to tell you all the steps because just if you're going to use it, just follow the instructions in the thing. I'm just going to lead you wrong if anything, but I will tell you that I like to use Warhammer paints to tint it because they don't mess with it, and tried and true method, we'll stick with that. Now luckily this thing was not leaking out of anywhere, which I'm pretty happy with. So I get my big head in there and I blow on it a little bit to get some of those small bubbles out. And then it's on to the masking fluid stage. This is Utrecht masking fluid. This is for watercolor painters who don't want areas of their watercolor painting to be darkened. And it's just a latex and it dries clear. Apply it with a sponge to get a nice random pattern anywhere that you want to have rust show later. And then I start painting this thing some vibrant colors. I go with blue I can't remember if I put it some places because it dries clear, but anyways, we'll just add some more, whatever. And a little bit of green. I'm using a lot more color here than I normally do, but I'm actually really happy with how it turned out. So that just shows, you know, take some risks sometimes, and sometimes they pay off. Nice fire engine red on this one. You can see I'm not being totally thorough with the application of color, and that doesn't matter because it's going to be so disheveled looking in the end anyways. The central pipe I went with a nice white because it just kind of ties in with some of the other builds I've done. And a nice bright yellow on the bottom. To get a good coverage with the yellow, I mixed it with a little bit of white because white pigment is a lot stronger than yellow pigment, and it really helps the opacity. And a nice little Eastery purple for the last one. Pretty good. And then I'm going to dry brush a little bit of gray onto all the sandy areas and some of the steps, just to add a little dusty appearance. I start rubbing with my thumb, and that lifts up the chipping medium, and you can see it has a nice chip underneath. And because I have resin there, I've turned it upside down so that any flakes and stuff that come away fall upwards and away from the resin. Next, I come in with some burnt sienna paint and just add some rusty streaks to the piece. That's looking pretty good. A few light ones onto the concrete as well, ties the piece together a little. And now it's time to add the waterfall. I peel that piece off of the parchment paper, and what I'm doing here is not good. I just kind of started wrestling with it, and it started sticking to itself, and that should have been a disaster, but I'm lucky, I guess. It kind of did stick to itself, but that looks more realistic anyways. Water tends to kind of converge into a narrower stream when it falls out like that, and it actually looks better. So there's some Mod Podge gloss that I've applied, and I'm now blowing through a straw to get a nice rippling effect. And that's going to be nice when it dries. And let's do a little bit in the mouth of that pipe as well. And there you go. That's my vision, is to have a little waterfall that you walk behind with the guys. Pretty happy with that. And we are done. I'd like to give a huge thanks to all my patrons, starting with my Master Crafter tier patrons: Robert Reisholt, Joseph Hobbs, Stephen Scott, Papig69, Nadia Hamdi, Mike Huey, Alice Ferraris, Lichlord Zomb, and my new patrons Tom Marino, Clea Forker, Jacob Stevens, Hannes Joseph, Jay Awesome, Ruscio, Eric Lamoureux, Bernard Homo. Thanks everyone a ton. I appreciate you guys so much. If you like this video, please like, comment, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.